He sanded the wood, blew a little on the surface, and looked thoughtfully at the twisting path of darkness on the dark wood of the keel. Definitely a crack, but there remained the question of nature or nurture. If the crack was on the surface, he could fill it with epoxy and sand it down. If the crack went all the way through the side, however, then the wood was simply bad and the boat would have to be rebuilt to replace the doomed part. Richard Thomas looked back at the warm, oily glow of the lights of the house 100 yards away as darkness thickened in the air. Putting all business aside, he turned back to his gloomy household. Things were promising again. He had married Karen Johnson, his high school sweetheart, shortly after graduating from college. She wouldn't even talk to a guy like him from a single-parent family, but she met him at a mixer at their church where free markets and social justice were preached. Be kind to kids from single-parent families, says her father, a psychologist. They are more like feral animals because life has treated them cruelly. You can't expect them to care about helping others, only themselves. Karen shunned most of them, but as she stared off into space, she happened to meet Richard's gaze. "Hi," he said to her in passing. She saw a rather muscular guy with bright blue eyes and hair the color of honey, quite handsome and slightly above average height. He was 1 inch short of 6 feet. She knew he was a bit of a bully in class, but he also got pretty good grades and had made himself a boat of sorts, for which he'd gotten an award. He intimidated her because his father was an oil company executive, which her parents said were evil people, and she knew Richard as a straightforward, outspoken guy who often left grudges in the past. "Hi," she said with typical teenage irreverence. Standing before him was a slender girl with an innocent face, unreadable gray eyes, and bright blonde hair. She acted as elegant as a dancer and had muscles from playing field hockey. He knew she got high grades but was quiet in class, as if she was waiting for an excuse to come out of her shell. An inch shorter than he was, she seemed lively but reluctant to open herself up to the world, though he suspected that if she ever became confident enough to have her own opinions, she could understand a lot of things. They talked the rest of the evening, touching on every possible random topic interspersed with predictable familiarity. Karen went home that evening in a state of profound confusion. Like most of her generation, Karen had no idea what love was or how it related to attraction and lust. She got one idea from the classic books they read in school, another from Hollywood and popular music, and a third from church and her parents. In the movies, a beautiful man and a beautiful woman would meet in some awkward situation, then start arguing in what her psychologist aunt called a codependent relationship, but end up in bed together and discover in the morning that they were in love. The books she was assigned in school praised men and women who escaped society's pressure to remain virtuous and then met their true love and companion in the midst of selfless labor. Her parents emphasized finding a man with a good career who wouldn't destroy the family but wouldn't treat her unequally either. She never saw Richard as anything but one of the guys she would leave behind with the rest of the school, but she sensed something that might have been a desire to make him love her, approve of her, even desire her. Karen and Richard had started dating in their last year of high school, that bittersweet time when people realize that approaching adulthood will shatter old friendships and loves. She knew Richard was afraid of her too. One day in history class, the teacher noticed that most of the students were catatonic or asleep, and pounced on Richard with a question about Hitler and Stalin. "Tyrants confuse what they are with what they could be," Richard said. Stalin, a former bank robber, confused power with importance and turned his country into a bureaucratic dictatorship that killed 30 million people because of his incompetence. Hitler, an artist, confused popularity with moral purity and started a war that devastated his country. A good leader rules for the sake of his people, not for his own power or self-aggrandizement. The teacher furrowed his eyebrows. Half the class flinched. "What about war crimes, genocide, and oppression?" Richard grinned. "History is written in blood, brutality, and extermination because those are the only signals that wake people up. Otherwise, they just follow their own inertia. Hitler was like Robespierre, a true believer, who ended up executing anyone who disagreed with him because he needed to believe in the truth of his ideology. Stalin was more like Genghis Khan, a glorified criminal or Third World warlord who knew his ideology was bullshit and as a result was able to survive, mostly by sacrificing others. They're almost as bad as our current leaders who are doing the same thing to us, only slower." At that moment, Karen realized there was something about Richard that she couldn't tame. She liked domestic men like her father who followed the rules. When her mother had needs, he met them, and if he disagreed, he bit his lip and grudgingly complied. Her parents were equals and discussed every decision together. Compared to him, Richard was like a wild animal, acting purely on instinct and the dictates of his heart. And she knew it was impossible to control, but at the same time, she knew in her gut that he was the only man she could truly love. You need to go out with other boys, her mother had told Beverly. You can't be involved with only one man your whole life. It will always be an unequal relationship in which he will have the upper hand. He has to know that there are absolute rules that he can't break. Marriage is like a small social group where, if you don't assert your authority, you will be forced to conform to what others want. So Karen got into the rumor mill and started dating other boys. It never went beyond petting. It made her moderately popular and she graduated high school on a high note. If Richard ever noticed her abilities improving, he never questioned why, or at least never said anything. Richard received a full scholarship to the same local university as her, but Karen's mother decided to try out a wider range of sexual partners. No one was fooled by her work delays or bachelorette parties. The marriage disintegrated like a sparrow hit by a spaceship, scattering Karen and her brothers to different apartments on both ends of town with varying degrees of lack of money. She finally understood what Richard had gone through, except that his father was an executive of a major oil company, and they had more money than her parents, a school psychologist and high school history teacher. She escaped the middle-class poverty and disorder in which she lived and married Richard. He got his first serious job and they had children. Daniel when Richard was still working at the entry level, Kaya, Robert, and Suzanne after each of his promotions. Soon, they had a nice house in a decent suburb. "Are you happy with it?" Richard asked Karen one evening. "I think so," she replied. "I'm not sure that's the right question. Are you happy?" "Happiness," he said. "I don't believe in it." He read her a book he'd been reading, his old favorite, which she'd never liked. "You're a bad driver," I protested. "Either you should be more careful or not drive at all." "I am careful." "No, you're not." "Well, neither are other people," she remarked lightly. "What's that got to do with it?" "They won't bother me," she insisted. "It takes two to have an accident." "Suppose you meet someone as careless as yourself." "I hope never," she replied. "I hate careless people. That's why I like you." "Each of us is responsible for our own happiness," Richard said. "One must be responsible to one's true self. You have to do yourself well to please yourself, and only then can you appreciate what life is really about." She looked at the man as if she barely knew him. "It looks joyless." "Not at all. It's just a realistic view of things," Richard said, smoking his pipe. "Who you are, your job, and how others see you is not who you are. You choose who you become. Even love is a choice. As Siddhartha would say, external events neither please nor displease, but thoughts make them so." Time passed and they both forgot that conversation as a faded story. By the age of 30, Karen was running a household that was old enough to take care of itself on her own. As parents have found out, by the time children reach puberty, your window of opportunity to teach them something has passed. They enter adulthood, albeit early, and make decisions on their own, based in part on what their parents have taught them, to the extent that they trust their parents. Richard had gone from a job where he came in and did what he was told to do to a business, which meant that he spent most of his time thinking about how to get his company into a position where it had enough money to acquire a stable market niche in which it could expand. He now had 3 employees, 2 negotiators and an office manager. The office manager, Sue Scott, came to him right out of graduate school. She had an MFA in creative writing, but she found that the insular little community that endorsed the next big thing in literature had clear tastes, and she, who loved the classics and ancient texts, her undergraduate degree was in classics for their timeless themes, wasn't going to make it in a world of the latest ironic styles and personality quirks. "What do you hope to accomplish here?" Richard asked without looking up. Sue, she didn't like the name Susan, which she thought sounded like furniture, looked up at him with bright gray-blue eyes. "Mr. Thomas, I like to be blunt," she said after a few minutes. "I need a job I won't hate. My college education is worthless, so I'm starting over. And I want to learn practical business skills so I can open a cat rescue service someday and not go bankrupt like so many have been doing for years." I'm here because out of all the places I've called, the people here seemed genuine, and everyone was honest with me. Richard hesitated for a moment. You've been hired, he said. What? She whispered and averted her eyes. No, it's not because of your, looks. We're professionals here and we don't do that because it might offend the other person. I warn you, I'm not a sensitive person, I'm a caveman. But I like fair play. No, you took a big risk with that answer. You told the plain truth. And judging by your university studies and part-time job, you're very competent, so I'm betting on you. Despite having to learn a new language for the business at first, she quickly got the hang of it. Richard was not attracted to her at first, although she was an attractive girl next door, with a thin, graceful face and slender body. But when he began to rely on her daily, he saw that she was intelligent and diligent. However, he was committed to his marriage, his business, and his notions of fair play, which meant he didn't want to cross that line, especially with someone who was a few years younger than him and financially vulnerable. What? She asked him one day. I beg your pardon? He said. You were looking at me like you wanted to say something, she said, ignoring her boss's deep, smoky gaze, which he momentarily forgot to hide. Ah, just pondering a client meeting. He brushed it off. That turned out to be fortunate because later that week she showed up with her boyfriend Alex. He was a dancer, muscular as a boa constrictor, and agile enough to balance on one leg on the railing above their two-story conference room. Richard returned home and took a cold shower, realizing for the first time the pain of temptation and the satisfaction of rejecting it. He had passed the test and won. Life went on, and soon he was once again consumed with building his company, making his first attempt to fix the old sailboat left to him by his grandfather, and caring for his children. He quickly forgot about Sue except as a coworker, and was grateful for that. Karen had more free time and took a job at the advertising firm where her uncle worked. The kids were already busy as adults. Sports, rock bands, art classes, ballet, debate, and martial arts after school, and then sitting on their phones or doing homework until midnight. She started as an administrative assistant. In her second week on the job, the manager above her quit, and before Karen knew it, she had taken the position. She had to spend at least 10 hours a day in the office, but by getting up early she made it, and her husband, who came home early, was able to make dinner for the kids. She shared her fears with her mother, Beverly. I feel like I'm turning into two people. One is home, where there's no glory, just more socks to wash. The other is my career, where I'm rising fast and now I want to move to the city. It's a necessary part of growing up, her mother said. You've overcome the inequalities of being a woman. You've given up being defined by who you are and the roles that society has defined for you. And now who you are matters. You're part of this economy and culture, and now you matter, even more than the loser you married. He's not a loser, Karen said. He came back, got his JD and MBA, and now runs a negotiation firm. We live a very comfortable life. Yes, but who will remember him when he dies? Her mother said. He's just another blank face in a suit and tie. You, on the other hand, are breaking boundaries by engaging in an endeavor that is both progressive and will soon yield huge profits. Your life is given meaning by what you are and what you do. Beverly was still working at the same job in the school district where she met the man who became her second husband. However, it turned out that his wife was willing to forgive his transgressions, so he came back to her and did not run off with Bev as they had planned. She ended up living alone, but had an active social life and was recognized in several local magazines for her work in fostering Christian compassion for the disadvantaged. When Karen took the casserole to her father, who lived in an apartment he could afford after paying alimony and child support, he warily said, "Don't let work become your soul. They're not worth it. You are who you are, with or without a job. And a family is just a bonus. You will always be my smart, loving, kind girl. Take this from me. I've given too many years to work, church, and politics. I'd rather spend that time making better connections with people. If you want to be famous, write a book or something." Now Karen was wandering the catacombs of her mind in doubt. She had never been one of those kids everyone knows and talks about, just a goofball, although she had excelled in school and was highly respected. Although Richard made good money and was a loving father, he wasn't like the men she'd read about in the news who invented new social networks, made rocket ships, or ran nonprofit organizations that gave microloans to the hungry in third world countries. Karen was promoted again when the company fractured due to a possible merger. Half of the employees left the company out of disgust at being swallowed up by a competitor. But for Karen, the move was brilliant because it more than doubled their market share. She took over the positions vacated by the defectors. When she presented her ideas to her boss, Jeb Sheehan, he visibly brightened at the potential benefits of her new marketing direction, which combined sound capitalist wisdom with advocacy, and insisted that she work with him directly. She soon found herself spending more and more time in the office. Her family, like all organic beings, adapted. Daniel began to cook more, as did Richard. The younger ones helped wash vegetables and clean the house. They were all proud of her, she thought, though she sensed some hesitation on the part of her spouse. During this time, she grew close to Jeb, and they eventually developed a close working relationship as they reorganized the bloated company into a cohesive fighting team aimed at dominating the market. Her friends barely recognized her. Karen had revamped her closet and worked out for an hour every morning at her home elliptical gym. She knew she looked like $1,000,000 because heads turned when she walked into a room. The former high school student not only overcame the glass ceiling and overwhelming inequality, but she became desirable because of her mind, body, and personality. Her family took a back seat to her background. Richard observed this from the sidelines, having experienced it many times in his day job. Eventually, his mother left to become an executive vice president in Bangkok, but he never mentioned it to Karen. What was at first a nagging ache in his gut turned into heaviness, then emptiness, and finally a spasm. He began to notice that sometimes he was short of breath, as if he had forgotten to breathe, and that he often felt spasms in his bowels. "You know," Richard said one day as they were cutting string beans for Saturday night dinner, "I always try to apply the wife test at work. If I'm doing something and you walk in and get upset about what I'm doing, I'd rather not do it. That even applies to staying behind closed doors alone with a female coworker." "Honey, I don't care," Karen said absent-mindedly, and in that moment Richard saw her outlook change. There was no jealousy, which meant that she already cared enough about him to possess him to the exclusion of all others. Richard knew that for love to exist, it had to be jealous. Otherwise, it was just using another person for convenience. "That's a good rule," he said. "I mean, if you want your spouse to be happy, are you happy, Karen?" Karen answered nothing. They fed the children, watched a terrible action movie that had everyone enthralled by its crude action, and then went to bed. Richard leaned on Karen's spoon and tried to pull her to him, but she pulled away. "Not now," she said in the same voice she would speak to a subordinate. She rolled over onto her back and, by the light of a small booklight, began to look through a folder of documents related to the upcoming merger at her company. Richard drifted into a restless sleep. He knew from his natural history lessons that when a female rejects a male, it means she considers the other male superior to herself and will never go back to the old one unless her gambit fails. Raised on the idea that love involves rejecting all others rather than constantly seeking new opportunities, he found her response troubling. He drifted into a troubled sleep, tormented by dark thoughts and images. When Karen got up, he was nowhere to be found, but he soon came running up the driveway. Over the next few weeks, Richard ran 5 miles a day, worked out at the home gym in the garage, and refurnished his old slouchy closet. Saturday night, the babysitter showed up, and he took Karen to her favorite Italian restaurant, a movie, and an elegant new club for strangers to drink and dance. She danced with him twice, then checked her phone and told him they had to go home. He was afraid of what he'd seen so many times before. People mistook signal for action, map for territory, appearance for reality, gesture for meaning, and what they were, for what they were. The grass is always greener, he thought, because you knew the disadvantages of your current situation but saw only the advantages of moving to another. In his experience, things started out well in the new grass but then ended disastrously. He doubled down on his courtship. He showed up at her workplace with flowers and saw her secretary roll her eyes. He wondered what she had been told about him. He called her twice a day, nonstop, and repeated his Saturday escapades. After losing 5 pounds, he intensified his workouts and soon noticed that his muscles had more definition. He bought her a necklace she spotted in a jewelry store window. He could feel the error approaching like a distant storm, but was powerless to stop it. In each case, she expressed her gratitude, stayed around for the minimum amount of time necessary to be polite, and then went about her business to prepare for the next day's work. "You've been rather aloof lately," he told her one evening. "What can I do to keep our marriage afloat?" He looked at her with blank eyes. He knew there were two options here. She recognized the problem, they worked on it, and life moved forward because they were in unison. That meant she still believed in him, respected him, and was on his team, working on their common interests. She denied the problem because she either didn't think it could be solved or wasn't interested in it. This meant that in her heart and mind, she had already given up on marriage and considered it unimportant. "What do you mean?" whispered Karen. "We don't date anymore. We hardly ever make love, and when we do, it looks like waiting for a cab. We rarely talk. Since you took this job, I haven't seen you smile at me uninvited or spend time with me unless I demand it," Richard said. He knew where this was going, and to his surprise, it didn't make him angry in the slightest. He felt sick, hurt, and uneasy. He watched everything he wanted slip away, like a candle melting and pouring down the drain. Karen looked straight at him. To him, it was a crisis. To her, it was a delicate situation that needed to be set aside, the way one sets aside a salesman who wants to get paid for his work. She thought about eventually returning to the marriage she now thought she was happy in. She had better opportunities now, and marriage was her backup plan for when she stopped enjoying everything life offered her. "I haven't noticed any problems," she replied lightly. That night they went to bed in different worlds. They could have been in different dimensions, on distant planets, or belonged to different species. All they had in common. Richard wondered where he had gone wrong, but then realized that Karen had always led a crusade in which the oppressed stood up to the powerful. Being a good husband and provider made him the powerful entity she rebelled against and enjoyed defeating. He talked to his longtime friend, Sheriff Danville Harris, who counseled his father during the divorce. "She dances with the devil," the sheriff said. "I've never been into religion other than the general belief that some beneficent force created this place and is taking care of us since we're basically suicidal." He grinned. "I always thought the Old Testament God must have drunk a huge bottle of Advil, watching his people go out on the streets and do nothing but screw up all the time because their egos get in the way. In the police academy, we were taught a little bit about Jung and Freud, and the ego and the ID. Basically, it looks like this." The sheriff lit one of his favorite Italian cigars and cut it in half with a penknife along the bulge in the middle. "The ID makes decisions. It's basically who we are in our insides and souls. The ego explains what happens in response to our decisions to make us look good to ourselves and others. And it is what we consider what we are. The ID is a multitude of conflicting impulses, and the one that is least destructive and most beneficial wins, at least in theory." He lit a cigarette and continued. "We were told in the academy that you have to explain the ego so that the ID chooses the path of least resistance. Make it impossible to fight or run away, offer food, and most of the time you can get them into the system without violence. With your wife, it's the opposite. Her ego makes the decisions, forcing the ID down that path so she loses a sense of who she is." "I guess the question for you," the sheriff said, taking a quick puff to light his fading cigar again, "is whether you want to make things right. After all, she has, as they say, shown you her ass. It's not just a superficial flaw, but something that went wrong deep inside her. Life is just a ladder. When you go where you need to go, it's a hard way up. When you're not going where you need to go, it's a hop and a skip downward. She went down the stairs to the bottom and can't find the stairs to the top. Do you think she cheated on you?" "No," Richard said. "Not yet. Physically. But in my mind, she's ready, and now that I know it, I'll never be able to enjoy her again. My faith in her is shattered, as is my respect. After she herself rejected me, she simply threw away my love, trust, affection, and hope." "That is undoubtedly true," the sheriff said. "When you choose another man, you tell the first one that he's not good enough for you. And that leads to only two choices. Either you take him back but resent him, or you reject him so you don't resent yourself for agreeing. In my experience, once they make a decision, they may not be out the door right away yet, but they're already headed that way." "Uh-huh," Richard replied grimly. "Well, thank you, Sheriff. I'll figure something out." The next time he saw Karen, that evening when she wasn't late for work, he gently suggested they spend more time together to save the marriage. Then he tried to invite her to ballroom dancing lessons, but she declined, citing her workload. He spent hours on foot massages, conversation, and wine of the finest variety. To no avail. In each case, he felt her contempt, realized how insignificant he was in her eyes, and felt several more tons of grim hopelessness and gray misery pouring into his gut. At last, he simply asked, "Do you want a divorce?" Richard asked. "What?" Karen said. "Why are you asking that?" "I want an answer first, yes or no." Karen went back to reading. "No, I don't think so." "Why not?" "Well, it would be inconsiderate, wouldn't it? We have children, we have a house. We both have careers and we benefit from having spouses and, Richard said slowly, stretching the syllable. "And I love you," Karen said, lowering her eyes to the floor. "We'll grow old together. We'll have grandchildren. We'll be able to buy that house on the lake we've always talked about and spend our golden years there." Richard looked at her, his eyes clear. She couldn't see the tragedy in them. When they had loved each other, she would have told him he was a big stupid idiot and showered him with kisses. Now she was treating him like a subordinate at work or maybe an uncooperative supplier and basically silencing him. What about meeting him halfway, supporting him and making him feel loved? No, that was as dead as their sex life. 14-year-old Robert gave him the next piece of the puzzle because all of life is a puzzle, and the first step in solving a puzzle is to identify all of its pieces. "Remember that girl I was going to go to the fall dance with? She left me to go camping with Owen Rogers and his weird family." "Is that the one you gave the necklace to?" Richard asked. "Yeah, just a week ago," said Robert. "You know, alpha males and beta males. Girls want a stable guy who provides money and a stud for sex." He blushed slightly at those words. "You're a nerd, but you're also a stud," Richard said, stroking his hair. "True, it'll take a few years, but one day some girl will realize you're attractive. Do you want to come to the gym with me? We can tighten you up a little." "Yeah," Robert said. "That would be great. I've seen you tighten your muscles, too." 4 miles away, at an awkward distance, separated by the social convention that men shouldn't show up at their wives' workplaces, Jeb was having a similar conversation with Karen. "He's a good guy, a good, reliable husband," Jeb said. "But you and I are doing something huge. This is going to be the first advertising firm in history to combine good deeds and big profits. We're going to make history. So I need you. All of you, if you know what I mean." Karen lifted her head, her eyes dryly focused. They both knew what he was talking about. Back at the house, Richard fed the children, read to Suzanne, helped Kaya with geometry, and called Daniel, who was attending a state university on a full scholarship. He decided not to waste any more time with his wife and to enjoy the children more. When Karen got home and went straight to the shower, bringing her phone with her, he shuddered in bed. His gut began to twist painfully and a cold sweat came to his eyes. He hardly slept that night, though Karen snored softly like a purring cat. In the morning, looking in the mirror, he saw how dead still and unlit his eyes were, their usual bright blue color reduced to a dimensionless cobalt. He didn't recognize the expression at first, but then he remembered it from his high school volunteer project at the Veterans Hospital, where he'd met people who'd seen too much of war. They were the eyes of a man trying to contain his agony, unsure if at any moment the devil might spill out from within and leave a bloody wasteland behind. "Everything all right?" Sue asked him mid-morning. They were struggling with a new contract that was going to squeeze their schedule and possibly take a toll. "Didn't get much sleep," he replied. "That's about it. I'll have some more coffee and gather my thoughts." She looked at him with concern. "I'll get the coffee. Don't get used to it." He finally smiled in spite of himself, and by the end of the day he had everything set up, negotiated additional fees, and put together a 6-month schedule that could be coordinated with existing clients. He said goodbye and drove home, letting his mind unfocus and relax, as he had long ago learned in Vipassana training. And then it hit him. Marriage was a love partnership, a family, and a business. He needed to solve the problem the business way, and then use business logic to fix it. Over the past few days, he had done a little research on cheating spouses. It turned out that most of them were just bored and feeling insignificant. Usually, this happened at work, which replaced the sense of well-being that family provided. When self-pity and lust coincided, the desire became strong. Most romances went unnoticed, though in his experience that usually meant the marriage was a zombie, a once living thing, now dead, but reanimated without a soul. Few of them lasted long, though, as he'd noticed, if someone cheated once, they were more likely to do it again. He'd also read stories of similar tragedies online. They seemed unbelievable to him. He couldn't imagine the desire to hurt his wife, nor the rage. Instead, he felt pain. Deep pain reverberated through his body, throbbing in his eyes and fingertips with every breath. It was simply a tragedy, an unresolvable tragedy. Stories of reconciliation seemed unrealistic and overly emotional to him. What had been was broken and could not be rebuilt. "Daddy!" Kaya greeted him at the door. He looked up and saw 3 pairs of his children's eyes staring intently at him. They knew, he realized. They always know, he thought, remembering how he had felt an inner pain and gut feeling when their mother came home late, and how, when he looked up and caught his father's gaze, he saw the same directness and implacability in it. People in pain look at life in terms of diminishing opportunities, he realized, so his first step was not to do it. The second step was to take care of the children. When Karen arrived home late, an immaculately clean house awaited her. 2 large pizza boxes were in the hamper, homework was done, and the kids had already gone to bed. She couldn't find her husband, at least not until she looked out into the backyard. There, in the light of Coleman's flashlight, he was sanding an old boat. She turned on the kitchen light, knowing it would be illuminated by the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked up but didn't wave his hand. She went to bed. Friday morning, he went out for a walk, covered in sweat from his jog. Karen was just getting ready to go out. "Richard," she said, as if an impulse had suddenly swept over her. He felt the air between them ionize. "I forgot to tell you I'm going away on a business trip this weekend," she said. He nodded. There was no point in talking her out of it. She'd already done it with her mind and heart. From what he had read, he knew that the act of cheating occurred when a cheater psychologically relegated their spouse to the level of someone who could be deceived, manipulated, and misdirected. Almost all of them saw this as their merit or compensation for past wounds, and so they didn't just use their spouses, but on some level hated them, even if they couldn't admit it. Richard believed that society had 2 levels, corresponding to ego and ID. The ID consisted of repressed desires left over from nature, and the ego consisted of how he explained them to himself as something good rather than bad. When he heard someone say, "We are all equal," his mind translated that into "me first." When they talked about patriotism or free markets, it meant "and others serve me." When they talked about the sanctity of marriage, it meant neutralizing the man with rules that forced him to serve the woman. He thought Karen was different. He'd loved this shy, sensitive, and perceptive girl he'd first met at a church mixer since their first date. He hadn't told her for a long time, adhering to the fair play code he and her father shared because he didn't want to embarrass her or make her feel manipulated. He wondered if he was always wrong or if something had finally caught up with her and threw her off balance. "Is there anything I should know?" he asked softly. "No, Richard, nothing," she replied with an annoyed look, then got into her car and drove off. Nothing. The feeling descended on his soul, an eternal and endless emptiness where nothing mattered but momentary sensations. He wanted to become one with this void, to clear his mind of everything and exist only in this crystalline structure of logic where every detail was in its place, forming lattices of knowledge, each level dependent on the one below. He wanted to separate himself from emotions, sensations, desires, and most importantly, from the realization of who he was and the situation he was in. "Daddy?" Suzanne asked, looking into his eyes. Richard had come to his senses. Work was over, he had somehow managed and was now at home with his children. The clarity of his inner world, connected to a wider world than his immediate concerns, was a wonderful refuge. Emotions came back to him quickly. Awe, the feeling of watching the travesty from afar, and a damp, blood-scented sense of profound loss. "This too shall pass," he reminded himself, and turned to his daughter. "Are you all right?" she asked in her thin, trembling baby voice. "Now that you're here, I'm perfectly fine," Richard replied. He went to work. He was doing well. He was marvelous, even inspired. He was giving his work all his nervous energy and his growing sense of despair, and the results were good. Now he had to take care of his little charges, and he had an hour or so after work to get his thoughts in order. Then he looked at his watch. 3 hours had passed. "And I'm late for dinner," he said. "Kids, it's pizza time again." There were cheers of approval, and they sat down to a few rounds of some hopelessly violent video game for boys, while Kaya read and Suzanne watched, for the 10th time, a cartoon about a duckling who saves the world with a chainsaw, or something like that. Richard was a little distracted. The local pizza delivery guy recognized them well, mostly because Richard had given a good tip in exchange for no small talk, and after a raucous pizza party had put everyone to bed. Homework would wait until Sunday afternoon. The next morning, they went to the zoo. Robert, already too old for that, politely snuck ahead and lingered at the reptile house. Kaya was fascinated by the birds, and they went around the open cages 3 times at least. Suzanne tried her best to see all the lions, tigers, bears, and otters, her favorites, but then she started to get cranky and, after getting cotton candy, fell asleep in his arms, sinking into a deep sleep in her father's shoulder. Then it was time for backyard games. We threw an old foam soccer ball and played horseplay until dusk descended on the ground like a warm blanket. Richard dug into his college memories and made a dinner of organic, hot dogs, bell peppers, spaghetti, cilantro, and pasta sauce with a little sour cream added to make it look like Alfredo. Then they'd read or play video games by the fire he'd built in a pit in the backyard while Richard continued polishing his boat. He looked around the long backyard that stretched out to the water of the fourth-grade canal on the banks of which they lived. In a city teeming with waterways, he understood the benefits of having one of the posh homes in the famous lakefront communities. But he knew there was a price to pay for everything. Here they could live a normal life, know other normal people, realize their unique abilities, and humbly enjoy others and their contributions. He knew that everything he did for the children, and if it killed him, he wouldn't let them live the way he lived. Richard never saw himself as a victim. He saw difficulties coming his way and would fall into a meditative state, which, oddly enough, he learned as a child from his Methodist pastor, to figure out what was really going on. How does the situation work? Once he understood the structure, mechanism, and process that formed the relationship between actions and consequences at every level, he could bypass the situation or make it work for him. He sighed, feeling grown up and perhaps more mature than he had that morning. Richard, a college kid with a mop of hair, big muscles, and a lust for life, would have looked at this quiet existence and laughed, then crushed a few more cans of Milwaukee's Best and gone to raise hell. Or maybe not. Somewhere Richard knew that's what he'd always wanted to do. He didn't believe in greatness and preferred an ordinary life in which his mind was clear, so that if the opportunity arose to make some great invention or go down in history, he could seize the day without mental turmoil. On Sundays they went to church. Richard knew in his gut that he believed in God, even if he didn't trust any book written by man, because he understood cause and effect. The sky is dark at night, but it can be dark from the weather, or from a solar eclipse, or even from the latest battle in Armageddon between the forces of order and fire. However, if the world as a whole is good, there can only be one thing causing it, and deep down, Richard had long ago found God and loved him, even though he hated organized religion as much as he hated politics and social media. He didn't bother to call his wife. Monday dawned early, and he put the kids in the car to drive to the local Korean Montessori school, which was not so much Montessori as classical education with modern flexibility. When he went to school, the teacher's lounge smelled like coffee and cigarettes, and the place smelled like yerba mate and weed. But like most realists, Richard didn't really believe in those categories. Some hippies were nice, just as some oil company executives were decent people. It was a complicated world, more complicated than emotions. Richard made friendly small talk on his way to work, and then spent another good 10 hours at the keyboard, phone, and file cabinet before returning home. Sue cast a few wary glances at him, but he responded with a slightly absent smile that expressed pleasure in his work, combined with determination. When you're a boss, you have to lead for the good of your people, and if you have to cheat them, it has to be, without exception, in their own best interest, even if they don't know it, he thought. Speaking of tyrants, his wife burst through the door late at night when dinner was already on the table and announced that she had eaten, then ran off to shower. The children exchanged knowing glances. Richard looked at his children, who represented something between his wisdom and raw intelligence and his wife's passion, and realized he couldn't fool them. "Listen, guys," he said suddenly, panting slightly. "You know I love you guys, right?" They nodded, looking up at him with bright, moist eyes. I'll always be there for you and Mom too, Richard said. If you trust me, don't worry about a thing. We'll get through this. Surprisingly, it worked. The kids, the spawn of an age of innocence that peels off almost imperceptibly like onion skins, trusted the firm word of an adult who seemed to have a plan. He helped them with their homework, helped them with the algebra he didn't know he remembered, and then put on his old fisherman's hat and headed for the boat. He wanted to take another look at the keel, and with new eyes he saw that the crack could very well have been something the builders had overlooked, maybe a knot in the wood or deep rot. He made a mental note to buy a replacement and then began to disassemble the boat. He might be able to lubricate and sand the replacement wood so the seals would be tighter. As he headed for the dumpsters with the pile of dead wood, he heard Karen talking on the phone. She was looking out into the living room, oblivious to his presence, and he stopped to shift the pile of wood scraps he was carrying. When I came back this morning, she said, turning slightly to bring the phone up to her eyes. She said, and stopped. He looked up and saw her eyes in the mirror on the wall leading into the living room. She was looking straight into his eyes. I mean tonight, she continued loudly, walking out into the next room and leaving behind what she was cleaning up in the kitchen. That's when it all started. Richard leaned forward, scattering firewood around him, and threw up on the small concrete pad where the trash can stood. He threw up once, twice, 3 times, splattering a mixture of half-digested food, the soda he'd carelessly drank at work, and stomach fluid so acidic he could hear it hissing and cracking as it spread across the concrete. Finding nothing in his stomach, he wiped his mouth, then took a hose and sprayed the concrete. Picking up the rotten wood, which now smelled faintly of phosphoric and hydrochloric acids, he tossed it into the dumpster and the lid fell off silently. Until that moment he had had his suspicions. Now he knew it in his gut, but he had no proof. He wasn't even sure he wanted it or that it mattered, but the part of him that was rigidly determined to play fair insisted on it. He pondered these thoughts as he made his way up the stairs. As soon as he entered the bedroom, however, he immediately ran to the bathroom, spewing out the entire contents of his digestive tract. The vomiting made him so twisted that tears spurted from his eyes, and he fell to the floor. Strangely, he didn't feel sick. He just vomited with great force, and the rancid liquid went down the toilet. He didn't feel sick, but unreal, disconnected from the earth. His condition was like seasickness, or car sickness, or heartache, he realized. Muttering something about not feeling well, he grabbed a pillow and plopped down on the couch. Soon he was sound asleep. The day had gone surprisingly well. He managed to get a lot done for a man whose life had been torn apart. He drank plenty of water all day, did a great job, smiled whenever his 3 coworkers walked by, and got home early to make dinner for the kids. They were having a great time until Karen returned, at which point Richard rushed into the bathroom, water in his eyes and saliva flowing from his mouth. He was squirming like a man in a hurry to kill himself, his body thrashing back and forth, dots of light flashing before his eyes, and dizzy. This time, however, the guest room gave him no shelter, so he covered himself with a blanket and took the key to the boathouse. The simple shack, designed for boat storage, had double doors, its own air conditioner, and a refrigerator for the beer parties he hoped to throw someday. He fell asleep on the old couch he'd gotten from his grandmother, wrapped in blankets and shivering not from the cold, but from the icy dread that came from within. The next morning he waited until she left for work, then drove the kids to school and stopped by his office. He told Sue he would be working remotely, grabbed some files and a laptop, and turned to leave. "Do you remember your fair play rules, Mr. Thomas?" Sue asked. "And about doing what's good for people, even if they don't know it?" She handed him the car keys. "I've heard something, Mr. Thomas," she said. "I hope it's not true, but if it is, you'll want to know every last gruesome detail, won't you? That's what all your friends say. Richard takes the pain away. So take my car, full tank, and do whatever you need to do. She won't recognize him." He stared at the keys. "Thanks, Sue. I owe you one," he said, holding out the keys to her, unable to meet her gaze. "Hell no," she whispered as he walked away. He drove her tiny Honda, which surprisingly started, to a small shopping center between the school and the church, where 2 real estate offices and an old colonial building with one-way mirrored windows housed an advertising agency. Parking at the church, He pulled out his binoculars and then wrote down in his notebook the license plate numbers and descriptions of the cars parked in the lot. He wrote down the times they came and went. Fortunately, the office didn't have an enclosed parking lot, so when Jeb came out, Richard could clearly see Karen get into the car. He took a few pictures with Daniel's old camera. When they drove off, he didn't do anything about it. The light cycle had trapped them, so he waited a couple minutes before he slipped out of the car and almost caught up with them at the next light. Keeping a dozen cars behind, he put binoculars to one eye so he'd know when they were honking. He drove another block, turned onto a side street, and saw them in the distance catching up. He knew this part of town well enough to guess where they were headed, toward the old Bayou Ridge Hotel on the edge of the woods. That's where I'd go if I wanted to have a sad affair, he thought. Finally, the little Honda pulled into the parking lot, and he took the shots he wanted, the two kissing in the car, entering the motel room, and leaving an hour later. He let them go, then lazily drove back to the office. They were just coming inside. He saw Karen lift her head and look around as if she had caught the warning, but then walked through the door. He thanked Sue once again in his heart for having the foresight to buy him an anonymous car. After sending the children to bed, Richard began his nightly ritual in the boathouse. If he stayed too long in the main house, he would show the first signs of a hepatitis attack. Saliva flooded his mouth and his eyes watered. Once in the quiet of the boathouse, where the waves were crashing against the small seawall 20 feet away, he fell sound asleep on the huge couch his grandmother had bought decades ago. He sensed she was still watching over him and crossed his fingers that everything would go well. I wondered what Karen was thinking about all of this. Her husband vomited profusely in her presence, didn't spend time with her on weekends, and seemed oblivious to her hobbies. They hadn't had much sex before the affair, but after the affair it had died down, also because her husband vomited whenever he was in her presence. It took Richard several months to realize what had happened and begin to deal with it. One of the links bookmarked on her computer. Yes, you can find the second Windows account because there is another folder for it in the user directory that you can see if you boot the recovery disk in administrator mode, described how to essentially shame or deceive your man. You broke his trust, made him find out about your cheating and accept it, and then ended all affection, but commanded him daily in the matter. He would come to his senses, she promised. The article left a bad taste in his mouth. The article, written by some purple-haired man with a manly face and wild eyes that showed 3 white sides behind the thick glasses, was written in a jubilant tone. It said that men had been killing women for centuries, enslaving them and lording it over them. Now it was time to strike back, destroying the good ones, obviously. It reveled in manipulation and belittlement. At that moment, Richard realized that his marriage was truly dead, because no one who loved him would treat him this way. It was abuse, and his wife was the abuser. He remembered his school counselor warning boys against men who wanted to be their friends. Someone who does something that is not in your best interest but serves their best interest is not a friend. That's a predator, or a parasite, or at least someone who wants to use you. And that's not love. It is never love. Get away from that person as soon as possible. A story that is rarely told in regards to infidelity, whether sexual or simply a refusal to respect a spouse that forms the absolute emotional and moral bond that allows a marriage to work, is the story of children. How does it affect them? Let's look at it with one eye. Robert, Kaya, and Suzanne called Daniel at college to tell him what happened. Dad lives in the boathouse, Robert said, annoyed at how thin and detached his voice sounded. Mom spends all her time at work, including nights, especially nights, and she's away on business trips a lot. Daniel sighed. I was worried about that, he said. Mom's always had self-esteem issues because she rushed into marriage and missed out on what her friends were doing. Partying her ass off in college, like in the sisterhood of the traveling pants. Having lots of boyfriends. Going to little villas in Italy, like in Under the Tuscan Sun. Having adventures like in Eat, Pray, Love. She acts like she's living in The Handmaid's Tale or The Hunger Games. I think she's worried that a movie about her life doesn't highlight her life enough. She's not really around us, Kaya says. We have to look for her to talk to her. And she's gone all the time. She's never home. All my friends' moms are there on evenings and weekends, Suzanne picks up on that. And she's just not here. It's like she's abandoned us. Daniel thinks for a moment. What's Dad going to say? He keeps saying he'll never leave us, Robert says. He's always by our side. When we go to bed, He goes to the boathouse and sleeps there. Believe me, my family is totally weird, Daniel said with a laugh. Well, it's about like that. They've got their problems, but you've got your dad. It's no different than what happened to Davis and Shelley when their mom went to a personal trainer at her gym, or when Kristen's mom went to live with her boss, or even Jake's house where his dad has a new girlfriend and his mom has an apartment next to the mall. So what do we do? Kaya asked. Do what? Daniel hesitated. Welcome to adulthood, kid. Other people are going to throw you for a loop. Dad won't abandon you. He's too fair and generous. Mom will probably come back after her little adventure, but it'll be like when Roger's mom ran off with that traveling preacher and then came back and things will never be the same again. Or when Kara's parents had an open relationship and now they're like roommates. Or, how our neighbor started dating her therapist and when she came back, things were kind of flat and unloving with her husband. Stay close to your dad and leave as soon as possible. Go to college or the Air Force or something. What's an open relationship? Suzanne inquired. I'll tell you later, Kaya said quickly. Later when you turn 18, she thought. Thank you, Dan, Robert said. We'll take it from here. That sounded more grown-up than he thought it would. Back on the canal, Richard finally got the boat afloat. He replaced the keel and many of the planks, but the old sailboat shone and had a beautiful wood grain. He remodeled and rebuilt the cabin, replaced the motor, which he suspected had simply died of metal fatigue, and moved down the canal to take the wind on the lake. He pondered an old myth. The ship in which Theseus and the Athenian youths returned from Crete had 30 oars and was preserved by the Athenians until the time of Demetrius Phalereus, for they removed the old planks as they became weathered, putting in their place new and stronger ones, so that this ship became a constant example among philosophers in the logical question of what grows. One side maintained that the ship remained the same, and the other that it did not. Plutarch, Theseus. He too had changed a few planks in his life, but now it was as solid as ever. He wasn't going to sink because of the decisions of someone who clearly no longer cared about him and hadn't for a long time. Even though the old boat was only 16 feet long, he had rediscovered the joy he had felt sailing with his grandfather and then his father, and found that old skills were quickly returning as well. Karen walked through the door after another hard day's work. Despite what Jeb had told her over the years, the workload hadn't diminished and her firm didn't seem to be going any higher than before. The press favored them, publishing many fine articles about their beneficial work in third-world countries. But the money wasn't coming in as fast as she expected. Her head was starting to throb, but she wanted a drink. Instead, to her surprise, she saw Richard sitting at the kitchen table. "Richard," she said. "How—" "Pills," he said. "The doctor found something that interrupts the gag reflex. I went to doctors for years looking for the cause of the vomiting, but they were all puzzled. Finally, one asked me if I was vomiting at night, and I said I wasn't. He decided that if it doesn't happen when I sleep, then it must be my head and not my stomach. They did a brain scan, MRI, which was horrible, but no tumors were found. It's just a psychological condition, and it's always been like that. I don't even have an ulcer. Apparently, it's a common reaction to stress. This medication shuts down the gagging for a few hours so we can talk." "So," she said, "what are we talking about today?" "Nothing much," Richard said quietly. "The kids are gone, and it's time for us to think about the future. We're both gaining seniority, so it's time to protect our assets. The papers before you concern the creation of a corporate trust in our names to manage our assets and protect us from legal liability. Especially since your firm is playing on the edge of the law and the rumors about it are getting thicker and thicker. Let me tell you, we need insulation. Have your attorney review it and return a signed copy to me, if that's okay." She looked at the papers, scanning them with an experienced eye. It was indeed a legal trust registered in their state with their attorney as one of the founders. "By the way, thanks for asking about me," Richard said. "I'm still living in the boathouse and having a great time. You wouldn't recognize the place with all the renovations I've done. It even has its own mailbox." He waited for her to realize what that meant. "I don't know if I need it," she said, looking at the papers. "We're doing fine as it is." "I'll sign it. And if that's the case, I'll need to start taking my income out of the family finances and putting it into a trust. That way, you will only have your paycheck left. Keep in mind that the trust includes our 401k plan, so this will protect those as well. Also, The trust will pay the kids an income that may not be enough to live on, but will be enough to get a little boost in life after we're gone. Okay, I'll take that to my attorney, Karen said. Thank you, Richard said. With those words, he left. In the office, he returned to his usual relaxed demeanor. Sue had waited 6 months to make her move. Richard had just finished working on the latest invoice for one of their oldest clients, and when he turned around, she was standing in the doorway with the early afternoon sunlight streaming in through the window behind her. She looked nervous, her fingers dancing lightly on the outside of the folder. Sue, Richard said, what can I do for you? I'm glad you're back, she said. Neither of them needed to explain anything. For the past few months, it seemed they'd known each other like old battle buddies. She anticipated his thoughts, he knew her vocabulary, what words she liked to use, what they meant, and how to gauge her confidence in this or that, and she seemed to do the same for him. If only he'd met her first, he thought, but that was impossible, and he'd never get his children back? No, this was just another dream, a pipe dream. Yes, what's done is done, he said. I'm actually over it by now. People on the internet were telling me I would experience rage, and I was experiencing sadness. People told me I'd drink a lot of bad whiskey, but I still think it tastes like cough medicine. People said you'd never get over it, but if I had any revenge, it was this. I'm over it. Everything I do now, I do for the kids. And you? Sue asked, raising an eyebrow. She was really glad to have her old boss back. Vintage horror movies, he said, and then grinned, looking at her shocked face. Movies, Sue. I love old horror movies from the 1960s through the mid-90s because after that everyone went on to Blair Witch or M. Night Shyamalan. Karen hated them and said they made her feel fear, like when her father and mother fought when she was a kid. So I just gave up. Put it aside. Now I'm catching up. He told her about the boathouse, the big screen TV with surround sound and other details he has incorporated into his AK life. After Karen. After Karen. But why did you come to me? Sue blushed. I'm in the process of finding a new business, she said, but it's complicated. A potential client was once in a merger with another firm, but now that the merger has partially dissolved, they may be open to new business. However, their former business partner wants that segment of their business. So here I am, wondering if it would be fair to throw my name out, even though technically the two firms are still connected. Richard was looking at her with typical male confusion, she thought. They take the world literally, as if everything around them were a woolly mammoth to be hunted or a saber-toothed tiger threatening a tribe in its cave. Only men could invent fire, she realized, but then they would burn everything in a primal childish delight, and then only talk about the various uses of flame. If the client is willing to cooperate, he said slowly, and the merger is truly dead, I would agree. But when he looked up, she was no longer there. After work, back at the boathouse, he chopped wood and reflected on the conversation. Who the hell was she? Gradually, it came to him. He felt a new feeling inside him mixed with excitement and awe. Of course she hadn't meant it. But if she had? He stood up abruptly, then sat down and ran through everything in his head. 30 minutes later, he had dinner ready for his kids and grabbed his car keys. He turned to the kids, guilt written all over his face. Go on, Robert said. No matter what you didn't look alive. Like this. I don't know, for weeks. And then he burst into tears. Richard pulled him to him and swore he would keep his emotions in check for the sake of his children, the innocents who had been led down the aisle by the gross desecration of what he thought was a good marriage. As night fell and the buzzing of insects and the quiet sound of sprinklers replaced the birds, he rounded the corner of the sidewalk leading to the apartment on the west side of town. Sheffield's apartment occupied a large stretch of one of the dreariest side streets he'd ever encountered, but it was a safe and quiet neighborhood. He checked the address on her phone and headed to the apartment, located on the west side of the large, sprawling complex. She opened the door before he knocked. Did you get my message? She said. I'm stupid, he began in an apologetic voice. But you came anyway, she asked. Why? Hope, he whispered. When we first spoke, it was clear to me that you were a who and not a what. You had vitality, honesty, and direction. One door closed, you opened another. You walked headfirst into it and told me the honest truth at a time when, in hindsight, I was surrounded by lies. I was impressed, and I'm still impressed. And today, I try to never fraternize with my coworkers, especially since I'm married, but I'm done with her, except that she provides stability for my children, whom I love more than anything in the world, he finished in a whisper. Richard shook his head to diffuse the situation. I had hoped, not believed, that you were asking me how I would have handled your situation. If I'm not mistaken, you made it clear that maybe I wouldn't be the bad guy in this equation. And I was hoping, until I realized that your words, if it was you who said them, made perfect, flawless, bloodless sense. She held out some kind of soft drink to him. He took a sip. It was a Dr. Pepper clone from Costco, which was better than the real thing. He took another. Thank you, he said. What's done is done, and wherever I stumble, I'll never know if I ever do. Sometimes things go wrong. A storm comes, the chicks fall out of the nest, and you find them the next morning when it's too late. God's hand, or an aimless, materialistic universe? I don't know, nor do I think it's my purpose to know. But damn it, I'm deluded. You've always been in my thoughts as one of the most real people I've ever met. What about Karen? She asked. What about Alex? He asked. Karen sighed. And here you are making me admit the lie from the start. Alex doesn't like women, if you know what I mean. He's my ballet teacher. I do it as a hobby because I enjoy it. I asked him to help put out the fire at the office because I saw the way you looked at me that time and I realized I didn't want to be the other woman. So hope was lost. I see, Richard said. I must have gotten it all wrong. No, she said. Things have changed. I'm not going to treat your wife like an imbecile. She made a choice, and she knows what kind of man you are. She's gone, Richard. Honestly, I could spank the stupid bitch, but I believe in the old parable. Never thwart your enemy when he makes a mistake. She picked up a soft drink and took a big sip. So I don't, Richard began, frowning his eyebrows. No, Sue said. I've known about this for months. I think you do too. He stepped forward and pressed his forehead against hers. Hope, he said. It's going to kill you every time. Not this time, she said, taking his hands in hers. Not in my lifetime. They talked about something, and he came to his senses on the couch, sat down next to her, and took her hand. This is unusual, but I'm an ordinary girl, she said. The last 1,000 years, maybe more, have been a mistake. There's nothing wrong with the rules, but if you don't mind things happening slowly, we'll set it up. All the while, they held hands. Hours later, he turned off the engine and stopped the car, risking not waking anyone and just running across the road. It was the most magical night of his life. From the depths of darkness to the top of a mountain, bathed in the sunlight of a spring morning. And not even a kiss. He'd held her until it was clear. What was done, and now they were conspirators on a mission of hope. A mission of faith, lost in a world of men intoxicated with power and obsessed with death. Could it possibly work? He fell asleep running that thought through his head. She had set rules. Never in the office, never in public, and never in front of his children. They would remain a secret, but she was, as she put it, with a fierce look reminiscent of her Norman and Scottish ancestors, all business. A moment later, he said the same thing, enunciating the words clearly so that no one, not his beloved, not the wizards of time, not the gods of the glades and fields, could understand his meaning. A choice is forever, he realized, and at any moment, it can all come crashing down, just as it had in those moments that had destroyed his marriage. At any moment, one could retreat from the abyss, but that abyss, he felt, was dark only on the outside, while the inside was full of light. They met in the evenings after the children had gone to bed in his rapidly improving boathouse. He liked to cook for her, but sometimes they would just sit and talk. He learned about her past, the shy, honey-haired girl who wrote well but never fit in socially, and he learned that she had a black belt in Gracie's jiu-jitsu. She elicited things from him that Karen never thought to ask, like how he spent his summers on the volunteer fire department in the Piney Woods. Their personal vocabulary grew, and with it their affection grew. One evening, sitting on the couch and holding hands, they both realized the time had come. Not a word was spoken. They got up and went to the bedroom where he showered her with kisses. Then they made real love, and then they fell asleep pressed against each other in the cozy hollow between his chest and thighs. Eventually, he worked up the courage to confess his feelings to her. It happened in a strange way, but I love you, Sue Scott. She burst into tears and ran out of the boathouse. He ran after her, but she raised her hand, which was a signal that it was time to linger, and walked away. Depressed, Richard returned to the boathouse. How could he have angered her with what he thought was a positive thing? She was absent from work. She wasn't aloof or cold. She just wasn't around. He divided himself between work and sneaking glances in her direction. Questions swamped his mind and he fought for control. Sometimes the good guys don't win, he remembered his father's words. Finished with his work, he stood up and mechanically made his way to the garage. There, he sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to comprehend what was beating in his head, or maybe in his heart. He drove home to feed the kids and listen with a manly air to stories about soccer and math class, about the boy who pulled his braid, rotten, and the diorama of the Battle of Hastings. When they fell asleep, he crawled, as was his custom, to the boathouse. She stepped out of the shadow of the wall into the light. I can't do it, she said. It would be like leading a secret life that no one can see. I can never be who I want to be. Your wife and the mother of your children, and so no one can see who I am inside and why this choice is important to me. He wrapped his arms around her, pulled her to his chest and arms, and rocked her gently as she cried. The next day's work was just as agonizing as the day before. When Sue returned from lunch, she found a houseplant on her desk with a single purple flower peeking out from the moth-eaten, sun-bleached leaves. Most women would have thought there had been some mistake and thrown the pathetic plant in the trash, but Sue knew the language of her new love and went to the corner store instead. While her co-workers watched with open mouths, she transplanted the plant into a pot, spreading soil across the table, then trimmed the dead vegetation and watered what was left. She put the plant in the light, cleaned it up, and went back to work. That evening, as Richard took an aimless but leisurely walk because the children were waiting for him at home, he felt rather than saw her presence. If you want to leave, I understand, he said, surprised that it sounded more like a growl than the affectionate tone he had planned. She slipped out from behind a pillar. It doesn't settle in my head, she said, but it does in my heart. I love you, Richard Thomas, but inside, I'm upside down. He hugged her again. To know the words was to know when they would only lead to confusion. He was sorry, he understood. He feared for her. He was crushed. But instead, he just hugged her and felt her pulse with his skin. The next day, he stopped by her house an hour before lunch. She followed him silently, and they got into the car. He drove cautiously up to a slightly shabby church on the far side of town. A good-natured man with hair the color of salt and pepper, dressed in a cassock, stepped out of the glass door. Here she is, he said, holding out his hands. She's all I could ever hope for. How are you, my dear? Richard took a seat in the sanctuary and stared at the place behind the altar where generations had worshipped. Father Mueller poured her tea in his study, talking softly as he did so. About Richard and the long-ago divorce, about a family so thoroughly destroyed that he'd set aside 2 plots in the cemetery, and about the kind of man this young man had become, fighting every step of the way, hiding everything from everyone, accepting the pain and drawing strength from it. I don't know what to do, Sue said. My heart leans one way, and all the practitioners I know say it's impossible. Father Mueller nodded slowly. If you were stranded on a desert island, thousands of miles away from everyone you know, with no hope of rescue, would you be with him? Of course, said Sue. Then tell me, he said, what do you think marriage really is? Sue hesitated. It's a lot of things. It's a lifelong bond. It's a promise. I think it's a legal contract as well as a contract with God. He grinned. I don't know why he brought you here. I'm a terrible, heretical priest. I spend most of my time reading Buddhist theory and ancient Greek literature. I disagree with them that we show our faith to God by doing pious and charitable acts, and thereby earn a place in heaven. I think we do that by making hard decisions like this one and doing what is best for everyone in the material world, since God put us here for a reason, and in my opinion, that is the development of souls through suffering, including choices like this one. The priest sipped his tea and continued. My view is called sola fide, or faith alone, implying that faith is not about charity but about making yourself right. If your heart is pure and your mind is clear, you will do what is right here on earth and it will be just as right in heaven. We cannot show God our faith, but we must live it. This is the difference between love and a marriage ceremony. Life is random and has no plan. Stuff happens and how we handle it says a lot about who we are. He quoted, 8. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not of yourselves, the gift of God. 9. Not of works, lest any man should boast. Ephesians 2, 8, 9. In other words, religion is a good thing, but when it replaces practical, realistic thinking, it's a mental illness, he said. We can guess at what heaven wants, but it's clear that you both love each other very much and need to be together. This creates a conflict between ego, or a sense of self-worth as measured by others, and ID, or an inner desire to not only love this person but to possess them. But the ego is tied to the ego's boastfulness, and only the ID knows the true faith. Foster Muller sipped his tea and continued. That means that if deep down you love that person forever, then in God's eyes you are married. By the way, I think you are already married, and the rest of the species can shove their opinions where the sun don't shine. Besides, I have a few suggestions as to how you can get out of this situation. Thanking Father Muller, she joined Richard in the sanctuary. Together they drove back to the office. Sue broke the silence. You're right. He did help me clear things up. What scares me is that I won't have a big white wedding where my family will finally see me as more than just a loser, and all my friends will oohing and ahhing, and I'll finally feel like I'm somebody. That's what scares me. Time passed. The plant in her office grew. It was replanted several times, and eventually it became a small bush in the corner. Every evening, Richard tended to his children and then went to the newly built comfortable boathouse and made slow, tender love to Sue. He bought her an emerald and diamond ring, made a new group of friends who knew her as his wife, and got the business to buy the apartment where she lived with their rapidly growing brood. That weekend, she and Robert took to the water in a tin skiff with a fishing line, an activity his son had called fish hunting from an early age, much to the delight of his father and his fishing buddies. I never want to get married, Robert said. Richard chose his words carefully, as he often did, knowing that children memorize every remark their parents make, accidental or memorized, often for life. Talking to his children, Richard realized that he was not only Richard, but he was a parent, a general or dad to his family, and he had to be right all the time. Marriage is the hardest thing I've ever done, Richard says, but it's also one of the best things I've ever done in my life, if not the best. I brought you guys out of it, and you're not many universes of me, as I believe, but your own people who carry on the best of what Mom and I had. But Mama's never home, said Robert. It's like you're not married at all. I love your mom and always will, Richard said. She made a choice that, it's hard to say how things will turn out in the end, made things more complicated. I will always love her and forgive her, but her choices have consequences. Robert looked at the fishing line on the water. So that's why you live in the boathouse and Mrs. Sue comes to see you at night? You can never fool them, Richard thought. Yes, that's so, he said. She's a good friend. Is she going to be our mother? Robert asked. No, said Richard. It's a little unconventional, but I think most lives are like that, being both normal and dealing with the difficulties that arise. She's my friend, and your mom is your mom. She will always be her. We'll be one family, but just as your mom has her own needs and wants, so do I. Robert thought for a moment. Okay, he said finally. That makes sense, so I have two moms now. Yeah, pretty much, Richard said, pulling out what turned out to be a soft drink can overgrown with weeds. At this, they laughed and turned the boat back down the canal to their home. Robert headed off to see his friends, and Richard returned to his little house on the water with the ruined farm behind him. So this is what you've been up to, Karen began as she approached the boathouse. Richard was polishing the stupid sailboat as usual, though she had to admit he'd gotten further. It's nice that you're interested in what I'm doing, Richard said, puffing on his pipe to keep it lit while he applied another coat of oil to the wood drying in the sun. This boat has been in the shed for too many years, and perhaps it's always had some, how shall I put it, internal flaws, but I threw out the parts that shouldn't have been and replaced them with new wood. I signed the document, she said, holding it out to him. Rodolfo, my lawyer, said it was a pretty standard document and a good way to protect our money, but the corporate liability section seemed odd to him. What if we donate 10% of any profits to the Arboretum? Richard thought about it, but his eyes remained wary. At times like this, they regained the luster he had before he learned of her infidelity. No, the point about morality and indeed the need for contributions, Karen said. Sounds like you want to take over my paycheck and 401k. A trust only works if we put our entire fortune into it, Richard said. I send everything I earn into it just like I did in this marriage. That's why I signed it, Karen said. But I asked Rodolfo to add a clause stating that any personal purchases I make will be paid for out of my income before deductions. Richard hesitated for a moment. If the same applies to me, I don't mind, he said. That way we'll be equal and all that. After all, he had anticipated her request. All right, she said, walking away. Just make the changes. She congratulated herself on another successful business interaction, but in the back of her mind flashed the thought that Richard was a professional negotiator after all. Richard vomited a steady stream of green onto the grass, then hesitantly stood up to grab the hose. 10 years flew by unnoticed. When Suzanne left for college, intending to study compiler design and machine learning, Richard felt a sense of pride. All four of his children took up interesting endeavors. Robert, to his surprise, went into the Marines and intended to get professional certifications in HVAC and IT to manage SCADA network systems for climate control in warehouses. Kaya got a scholarship to a private college, and Daniel broke free and went into his own plumbing business, servicing luxury homes and corporate rentals, making more money than he knew what to do with. Suzanne was starting middle school. One sunny afternoon, Karen rushed toward the boathouse in a rage, but then stopped. What was this procedure? She knocked on the double doors. It turned out they were unlocked, and she stepped inside, clutching a thin folder in her hands. What in the name of all that's holy? She exhaled. Someone had replaced the old rickety boards with new grooved ones, and then boarded everything up. The house had a small bathroom, albeit with a composting toilet and electricity. He had an office, a kitchenette, a secluded bed in the former attic, and the coziest living room cave she'd ever seen, with leather couches angled toward the TV. The full-size refrigerator she'd ascertained was full of meat, beer, and rare vegetables that probably suffered from self-esteem issues. Did he throw parties here? It looked like it. For a moment, Karen felt left behind. Irresponsibility had taken its toll on her sense of self. She no longer mattered to her husband. When she noticed the women's clothes and bras in the dresser next to the bed, she realized in an instant that she had been replaced. What's more, this small room the size of a two-car garage seemed more cozy and inviting than the house she'd lived in for years. He'd even framed drawings each of the kids had done at school and pictures of herself and the kids on outings she didn't remember being invited to. A framed quote hung on the wall. I advise you to be on your guard, but I was never afraid. Be especially careful with alcohol, with other men's women, and a third, about men and their temptation to steal. H. D. Vam, L. 131. She heard the boat pull up to the dock as her husband stepped out of it and staggered across the dockboards, which sounded as if they were new, not faded and rotten as they had been years ago. Oh, hey, he said as he walked through the door. So do you like the place? Very nice, Karen said dreamily, then focused again. What the hell is this? She said, holding out a folder to him. Adoption papers for your secretary's children? No, Sue is my vice president, not my secretary, Richard said slowly. He tried to make his next words sound as soft as possible. They are my children too, but now they will take my last name and become part of our family so they can have their share of the trust. You had kids with that stupid bitch? What the hell? Karen stopped halfway through the sentence. Exactly, Richard said. You left me, and life went on without you. Counseling, Karen muttered. I want... But she stopped again. He clutched the card between two fingers. We have an appointment for this Wednesday. Richard turned to the table, shook out the contents of his pockets and remained in that position until he heard her pumps buzzing, then rushed to run toward the house. Night was slowly descending on the lake, as always, and the fireflies came out to play in the tall grass, being far enough away from the hustle and bustle of the roads to survive. A few days later, Richard pulled up to a large house in the center of town. It had once been a family home, but like much that was organic in nature, it had been displaced by commerce and the inexorable movement of progress. Richard no longer trusted its definition, and now housed an office where a consultant rented space. I'm Dr. Raoul Winslow, and we're here with Mr. Richard Thomas and his wife, Mrs. Karen Thomas. This is being recorded for the protection of my clients and myself. Now, there was a knock on the door. Richard answered it. "I'm Nick Randall, Mr. Thomas's attorney," said a tall man in a strict suit. "I'm here at my client's request to protect his interests and explain what's going on here." Karen looked at the three men in the room. She had chosen Dr. Winslow, a traditionalist Catholic with feminist leanings, because he defended women while supporting men's obligations in marriage to reconcile at all costs. Now the psychiatrist looked worried. "Karen is here," Richard began slowly, then changed the subject. "My wife found out that I've been living with another woman in the backyard of our house for the last 10 years and took our 3 children from her." "Oh, crap," Dr. Winslow said, then regained his professional expression. "And you didn't tell her about it because—" "She was busy and didn't notice," Richard said. His lawyer Nick began handing out copies of the photos taken outside the motels, each labeled with the year, month, and day. There were quite a few of them. "You knew all this time?" Karen asked incredulously. Richard threw her a pitying look. "When you love someone, you know their moods. You even know when they're going to fall out of love with you and keep you around just to finance the house and the kids," Nick said quietly. "After the affair was revealed, my client put his income and his wife's retirement portfolios in trust to protect them from events of this nature. You'll notice there's a morals clause on page 3 of the agreement which states that any member of the agreement who engages in publicly disreputable activity forfeits his share and is entitled to only a nominal payment of $25,000 per year." Dr. Winslow looked puzzled. "But if you knew about this case—" Nick said he knew she had done it once, but he didn't think she would do it again. When she repeated the process, my client realized that his wife had forfeited her share, and furthermore, she had violated the contract underlying the trust. As she continued to live in the house and spend the proceeds of his income on things for herself, he held out a sheet of paper with a dozen purchases. My client realized that, in essence, she wanted the contract to remain in effect, except for the spousal fidelity clause. He took a deep breath. That gave my client the legal right to seek similar life partners, and he began a relationship with Miss Sue Scott, with whom, as mentioned, he has 3 children, and is now seeking Mrs. Thomas's consent to adopt them so that they can bear his name and be considered in the eyes of the state as children born in wedlock. His decision to create the trust has proven shrewd, as we have credible information that Mrs. Thomas and Mr. Sheehan are using company funds for their long-standing affair. Dr. Winslow turned pale as things were not going at all as he had expected, and he, like most psychiatrists, knew no more than what his textbooks taught him, though he considered most of it abstruse gibberish. After all, over the centuries, psychotherapy had led to more mental illness in the population, not less, but he would never tell his clients that. "Let's take a step back," he said in a voice usually reserved for kindergarten children and the feeble-minded. "Richard, you noticed your wife cheating on you, and instead of trying to resolve the problem, you took retaliatory action?" "No, doctor," Richard said. "I tried many times to talk my wife out of infidelity. I exercised, upgraded my closet, tried taking her to fancy restaurants, coaxed her to talk to me, engaged in cunnilingus and backgrabbing, but nothing worked despite my legendary linguistic abilities. When it became clear that this affair was not a one-and-done, but a permanent replacement for me in the marital role, I deemed that part of the contract null and void on my part and found my own replacement in the absent and unsmiling Mrs. Thomas." Nick spoke again. At this time, my client was documenting the process of Mrs. Thomas leaving. He bought replacements for her toiletries, clothes, and personal items, then renovated the boathouse into a second home, and now only visited the main house to cook meals, clean up after himself, read, and socialize with the children. Nick held out another piece of paper to Winslow. "This is a copy of my client's application for a second street address for the boathouse, confirming that it is a second home. Mrs. Thomas apparently didn't notice or care that he no longer receives mail at the main house, and that his property never changed its location. I also have a picture of his toiletries with different expiration dates from almost a decade ago." "We're getting ahead of ourselves," Dr. Winslow said. "Karen, you should have an attorney review that document. However, we are here to conduct marriage counseling. Is there any way for you two to work things out, like having dinner together?" "I can't," Richard said. "Can't or won't?" Dr. Winslow asked. "I can't. I have a strange stomach condition, and when I am near her, I vomit repeatedly and violently. It's debilitating, and the medications that suppress this disease make me feel disgusting for days. Apparently, they're hard on the liver. And what's outside? Winslow continued, desperately trying to find a way to escape and still bill for a full session. He had a sailboat too, and, as they say, boats are holes in the water into which large sums of money are thrown. How about a vacation, somewhere in the tropics? Richard pondered. If I schedule a vacation, will you sign the adoption papers? He nodded to Nick, who, like the consummate professional he was, didn't let the smile drift from his soul to his face. Yes, Karen said. Then it's okay, Richard said. True to her word, Karen signed and certified the paperwork, and the adoption process, aided by Sue Scott, who had understood the complexity of Richard's situation from the beginning, began its slow movement through the creaking gears of an expensive but mysteriously underfunded bureaucracy. Richard left his plane ticket under her pillow. He thought about putting away all the old expired toiletries and clothes, many of which hung loosely on him but squeezed his new larger biceps and calves, but dismissed the thought. Instead, he went to the dock and launched the boat. Later, Karen picked up her ticket and smiled. Maybe this would all work out. She could have her cake and eat it too. However, when she arrived at the airport 2 days later in the morning, Richard was nowhere to be seen. Confused, she went through security, where she was only cursorily searched, and took a seat at the gate. Several hours passed, and as the plane began to approach for landing, she became nervous. Pulling herself together, she turned around. Jeb, she said, it was nice to meet you here. Karen? He asked. She looked down and noticed he was holding the exact same ticket. I found it on my desk, he said. I thought you might want to finally take that vacation we've always talked about. Karen smiled warmly. Let's go, she said. To hell with Richard and his little games, she thought. She'll have Rodolfo tear him apart when she gets back. Holding hands, they boarded the plane. The fish in the canal weren't biting, so Richard went to the house and got outfitted. He called Nick. Throughout the day, calls came in on the client list that Karen had carelessly left on her laptop. Each one looked as follows. Lawyer. Legal department of client name. How can I help you? Nick? Hello. This is Nick Randall from Mulhern and Rankin. I am calling regarding our upcoming litigation with the advertising firm that employs Jeb Sheehan, and I want to know if your firm is aware of an ongoing affair between Mr. Sheehan and his subordinate, Karen Thomas, in which we intend to deal with allegations of misuse of client funds. Were you aware of the extramarital relationship between these two? And did you notice any accounting irregularities in the billing? Counselor, I have to look into this matter. We will get back to you. He did not get a call back, but the message was relayed. Later, at the end of the day, Nick and Richard found themselves in front of the board of directors of Jeb's advertising firm. Nick began. It has come to our attention that Mr. Sheehan has been having an ongoing affair with his subordinate Karen Thomas for over 10 years. We found documents on Mrs. Thomas's computer indicating that mixed funds, if not company funds, may have been used to finance the affair, including lavish weekend trips. We intend to sue for damages to Mr. Thomas's business as a result of the publicity of this affair and the loss of trust that caused potential clients to shun the firm. And witnesses are expected to testify about this. According to numerous testimonies, Mr. Sheehan and Mrs. Thomas were openly having an affair in the office with the approval of the firm and, we can assume, the board of directors. We would like to know if you have a settlement offer. While he was saying this, a secretary entered the room and whispered something in the ear of the chairman of the board. Richard could only assume it was another client rejection as everyone involved tried to escape the legal storm of steel and feces that was rapidly coming at them. The chairman of the board of directors turned white, then red. We'll be in touch, he said. Richard and Nick allowed themselves to be led out the door. Message delivered, Nick said once they were out of earshot. 2 weeks later, when Karen returned home, she was in a bad mood. On her second day in Tahiti, emails came from the legal department reprimanding both her and Jeb. No one lost their jobs, but it was clear that their careers would take a hit after this fiasco. By board decision, Jeb was no longer a director of his own company. Jeb became enraged and ruined the rest of his vacation by calling his lawyers and ranting about how they couldn't do this to him. He then called his wife to explain, and Karen headed to the beach with a cocktail. Hold them, she said to the cabbie. Please. She slipped him $50. As soon as the plane landed, Jeb disappeared. Karen would never see him again outside of work. The next morning, Nick and Richard, dressed in matching suits, stood in front of Jeb and his lawyer. We intend to sue for defamation over the allegations made against my client, the lawyer began. Great, Nick said. And what else? Wait, what? The lawyer asked. You're new to this case, said Nick. I've been doing this for decades. You sue us, we get the evidence. For starters, we need Mr. Sheehan's schedule, his expense reports for all business travel on the dates we specify, and access to interviews of any employees who may have heard Mrs. Thomas and Mr. Sheehan discussing an affair in the office. The lawyer turned pale. We'll be in touch. In the meantime, Karen began looking for work, but found that every advertising firm in North America had received a letter of inquiry from the lawyer demanding details of her affair with Mr. Sheehan and the possibility of using commingled or corporate funds to finance the lovers' meetings in Las Vegas, Paris, New York, and Atlantic City. No wonder no one wanted to take her for a position above janitor, and even then, only on the condition that she take a rigorous ethics course that she would have to finance on her own. Richard swept across the house and handed her a check. This is your $25,000 for annual maintenance, he said. The house is free, and the children will be taken care of. You are welcome. Recovering from the shock, Karen followed him into the boathouse with a sagging jaw. I didn't realize you were so immature, she said. You're burning me out instead of trying to deal with this in an adult way? I tried, Richard said quietly as he untied the boat. You might remember that I spent a lot of time trying, but you didn't want to listen. So what if you ruin my life? Richard tossed the rope aside. Let me tell you something, Karen. On our wedding day, I looked into your eyes and saw what I thought was the path to happiness. Love, a family, support at a major job to pay for it all, a lake house, retirement, and traveling the world, and then spending our golden years in contentment and joy, visiting our grandchildren and pampering them. That was what I wanted. He continued, all of this you will never get of your own free will. You treated me like a servant or one of your office lackeys. You threw away our love and with it our future. Betraying a spouse can be endless, but the worst part is that you despised me. You treated me like an enemy. All I've done is tell this story so that the whole world will know that I am not a cuckold, but a man who is willing to put up with it. Their gazes met for a moment. Karen realized at once that she had never truly trusted him, for who could trust a reckless animal that no woman could control? Richard saw years of crying children, terrified by the breakup of their family, and the arrogance with which Karen ruled like a tyrant who gained power through his career. For a moment, anger flared up in him. To hell with her, he thought. To hell with Hitler. To hell with Stalin. To hell with everyone who lied for power, including every American leader since March 16, 1861. Richard sighed and smoked his pipe. I'm not a martyr, Karen. As a wise man said, there was only one true Christian and he died on the cross. Perhaps I am Siddhartha under the Bodhi tree or Odin, hanging upside down with a missing eye. I am one who learns from my mistakes. Your actions deprived me of what I wanted, and I have sought it elsewhere, but I refuse to divorce you because our children, the products of our love, deserve a full family and the knowledge that they were not a mistake, even though your actions signaled to them that I was a mistake, which is why they were born. As if on cue, a bright white sailboat, many times the size of his small boat, rolled up to the dock. Sue waved goodbye surrounded by her children. I forgot to tell you, Karen, but you didn't ask. We're retired. Sue runs her own consulting firm now, and I'm consulting. Since you wouldn't wait for me to travel the world, I'll go with her and the kids and we'll have a great time, paid for by the trust. But it's not revenge either, it's just getting my life back after cheating. You want to know what's better than revenge? Richard took a deep breath. I forgive you, he said. I have no resentment, no hate, no anger toward you. I just don't care. I forgave you, gave up on you, and shut down. Despite your best efforts to be who you thought you were, you've become irrelevant, and your ethics violations are your own problem. He stood up and walked toward the sunset framed by water swollen from the summer rain. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel and watch for the next video.